From privacy concerns to limitless potential, AI is rapidly impacting our evolving society. In this new season of the Brave Technologist podcast, we're demystifying artificial intelligence, challenging the status quo, and empowering everyday people to embrace the digital revolution. I'm your host, Luke Maltz, VP of Business Operations at Brave Software, makers of the privacy-respecting Brave browser and search engine, now powering AI with the Brave Search API. You're listening to a new episode of the Brave Technologist, and this one features Yan Zhu, who's been the Chief Information Security Officer at Brave since 2015. Prior to Brave, Yan was a Senior Security Engineer at Yahoo, working on end-to-end email encryption, and a staff technologist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where she worked on both open source projects such as HTTPS Everywhere and Let's Encrypt. In this episode, we discussed security challenges that are unique to browsers and how Brave builds your user profile differently using user-first principles, ways to reduce your risk of getting compromised when browsing the internet, along with the evolution of passkeys, two-factor authentication, and SIM swapping, how security and policy work together for establishing company culture, and best practices that ultimately protect both users and the company. Now, for this week's episode of the Brave Technologist. Yan, welcome to the Brave Technologist. How are you doing today?
Thanks, Luke. Yeah, it's great to see you again, even though it's been over a year now, I think, since I've actually seen you in any form.
I know, it's been a while. This whole remote work life thing is a little scattered, but I've been looking forward to doing this one too, like not only because you've been at Brave like forever, but also because you have like kind of a super interesting role at Brave too. Can you tell us a little bit about like how you ended up doing what you're doing, like getting kind of to Brave?
Yeah, so I've actually been at Brave for 8.5 years. So pretty much since the beginning. Before that, I was actually working on the security team at Yahoo, which is a company we don't hear much about these days. But back then we were starting this project to encrypt all of Yahoo Mail end to end. I was kind of leading that project from the engineering side there. Brendan, the CEO of Brave, reached out to me and said, "Hey, I'm starting something new. I know you've worked on browser extensions in the past, kind of in the security space. We'd really like to meet you and learn more about your experience." That's kind of how I found out about Brave, like a couple of months before we officially launched. Yeah, so I met with the team. Like people came out to SF. We met up in a WeWork and did some hacking, and it went really well. So yeah, I decided to join Brave shortly after that.
Awesome. Like Yahoo's pretty big, right? Like I'd imagine it's like a super interesting place to be at. But what was it about Brave that kind of moved you over here?
Honestly, I think I really enjoyed, I'd been working at companies of all different sizes and like a non-profit as well. So I think I've discovered I really like the small size companies because you kind of get to build the culture. You get to set the product direction from scratch. You don't have any bureaucracy to deal with at that stage. So it's just a lot more fun. Like you get to move really quickly and prototype things out. So that was appealing about Brave. And also the fact that it was a very ambitious project to just build a browser. Like when I had worked at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, we often had ideas where we were like, well, if someone just built a new browser, like this would be doable, but no one's, crazy enough to do that. So that's what drew me to Brave, is that like the vision was just very expansive. And yeah, and I've kind of been interested in like building out like more privacy and security in browsers. I've worked on this project called HTTPS Everywhere that automatically upgraded sites to HTTPS. I built the first version of something called Privacy Badger, which is an ad blocker that still is in use today. So kind of was just dovetailed very nicely into the things Brave was interested in.
Awesome. I mean, when you look at kind of the security challenges around browsers, what are those major security challenges that you see?
Right. Yeah. It's almost like asking like, what's the, big security issues with like operating systems, because browsers are responsible for so much of what runs on someone's computer. Yeah. I'd say like, if you asked me the same question 10 years ago, I would say the fact that most websites aren't using HTTPS or using encryption, just kind of like table stakes, right? Like if you visit a website, you want a guarantee that that's who you're actually talking to and that other people who aren't running the website can't read your communications. So we've pretty much solved that. Like I think we're over 95% encryption across the major websites these days. It's just kind of an ongoing battle, with things that come up. I know there was a while like crypto was really big, as you know. So there was a lot of interest in like Web3 and NFTs and all that, and like a new wave of phishing attacks. Some of them which were really interesting because I think crypto really made it so that it got very easy to steal money without major consequences by just stealing someone's wallet private keys. So that was interesting in that it made it really profitable to compromise a browser extension, right? Like if that browser extension has access to, or like for instance, if an extension is an existing wallet, if you can somehow compromise that or like take over that extension, you just get all the funds that are in it. So I thought that was a really interesting development, just seeing people come up with these like attacks, whether they're phishing or taking over existing software packages, supply chain attacks and so forth, just to get to like cryptocurrency wallets.
Yeah. I was going to ask you kind of how Brave's approach is a little bit different, but I think too, to just kind of frame it a little bit. I mean, it seems like with every trend, you're having to be right there in the middle of it. But one of those interesting things about Brave, I think that sets us apart from a lot of other places is that like, you're not only thinking about the security from like the user's point of view, but also company policy ethos point of view, right? I mean, that's a cultural thing, right? Like, and I've seen that kind of grow as a company, but what do you have to say kind of about how security's role is within Brave, how it's a little bit different from other places, or how you'd like to see other companies doing it similarly or differently?
Yeah, it's a great question. As you said, like my role is not just security on the product side, but also taking care of security internally, which is in some ways a much harder problem and more important because, yeah, you just think about the amount of work it takes to compromise like one employee at a company who has access to all kinds of internal resources. Like that's a much easier path to compromise than finding some kind of like crazy exploit in like the product itself. So it's often the case that we find that people and employee security is like the weakest link in the chain. I think there's not a whole lot of interesting work there. Like we kind of try to just follow the standard industry advice of, using two-factor authentication, using SSO when possible, not letting people make their own passwords, using password managers. I don't think I have a whole lot to criticize about the way the industry currently works. I think if I had to pick one, it'd be that people focus a lot on like certifications. We often get asked by enterprise customers like, oh, what certifications do you follow? I think there's this like common conception on the like security employee side that some of those are kind of just for show, like because they are point in time audits, like someone comes, they check your setup, they make sure like things are in order, you tick that box, and then you can tell your customers like, hey, we finished like SOC 2 or something. But yeah, like in some cases that does translate to actual security, especially if you have ongoing audits and you are like periodically checking those things. But I would like the whole industry to not focus so much on just checking these boxes and getting a better sense of like, hey, like what are the people in the security team doing? Like how do they actually respond to external bug reports and so forth? I think that's kind of an unsolved problem is like without relying so much on these like high overhead processes with certifications, how do you really assess like a company's security posture?
Yeah, and one of those other things too that kind of jumps out to me a little bit, it seems like a lot of the security work is really tied to policy work too, like the first principle side of things of like not collecting something if we don't have to, right? Like, I don't know, maybe you could kind of give people a little bit of color as to how it's almost like deniability, right? Like within the org. Is that something that happens everywhere, or is Brave kind of unique in trying not to collect all this data? I mean, I just bump up against it, on the business side a lot, but I'm just kind of curious how you all are leading there.
Yeah, I think everyone at Brave runs up into this question at some point because it's built into our culture. It's built into our core from the very beginning. If we don't need it, we don't collect it. That's to me the strongest like security decision you can make because if you don't have the data in the first place, there's no way for it to get compromised by compromising your company, which is this like centralized point of failure in a lot of cases. Yeah, and a lot of times we get asked like, oh, like how do you protect personal data? How do you protect financial data? Like, do you follow PCI and so forth? And our answer is like, we don't collect payments data. So we're not subject to PCI. We also just try to collect as little personal data as possible and only when it's very clearly presented to the user. Like if Brave is collecting your email, right? Like you've willingly given it, what it's going to be used for. You can request for us to delete it. We want to give you the impression you have like full control of any personal data you hand over to us. And at the same time, we try to push things out from like server side to client side to just minimize the amount of data we have to collect in the first place. Like our entire Brave Ads model is built around this idea that instead of building a profile of you from your browsing activity, which we collect, we simply build that profile like on your machine with your consent. And then that data never leaves your machine. And so, yeah, like imagine if we had in fact built ads with like, all of people's browsing histories, so that we could mine that for like what kind of ads to show them, right? That'd be like a treasure trove of data to protect. And it just helps us as the security team. It really helps us sleep easier at night, just knowing we don't collect that data in the first place.
There's always like a risk of like hacking and having that done, but also from things like authorities, right? Like, are people trying to request users information that if we don't have it, then they can't collect anything, right? Is that fair?
Oh yeah, this is a common thing, right? Like companies get sent. I don't know if people are generally aware, but companies frequently get sent subpoenas, right? Like in cases like a mass shooting or something. Like, the FBI is going to want to know, what do we know about the shooter? Like what kinds of searches were they doing prior to that? And they'll send out inquiries to the major tech companies or whatever, they infer that the criminal was using, and send out requests to those companies for all of the data they have related to this individual. And then it kind of falls on like that company's legal team to say, like, is this an overreaching request? Is this something we can put in our transparency report, or is it subject to some kind of gag order? Things like that, right? Yeah, and I think being in the position of just being like, we don't collect that data in the first place saves you a lot of time and energy, like trying to comply with these legal subpoenas and so forth.
Yeah, no, there's one thing that jumped kind of out at me where I was like really kind of grateful where we did this too, where you see like, oh, all of a sudden, I think it was like something with wallets or infrastructure on the crypto side of things. And I think like Consensus, who has like MetaMask, and then they also deal with Infura, where like collecting IP information from users. And we had done something that didn't do that. And it was like, oh yeah, because we don't need to, we can kind of detect on the client or something like that, not service it if it's not in a place that's there. And it's those little decisions that are like actually like pretty awesome. When you kind of have to deal with people discovering that, oh, I'm a little more out there than I thought I was, because people aren't necessarily thinking about their IP addresses when they're browsing on the internet, even though they're just kind of being broadcast out there. You've been here for over 8 years. How have you seen things change at Brave in your time from a security point of view?
Well, just from a general point of view, it's been so different. Like, I think we were like 8 people when I joined, maybe like 6 engineers. So it was, primarily engineering. I think there was Brad from design and kind of like Catherine from PR was there. But yeah, pretty much everyone else was technical at that point. So yeah, in the beginning, we were just very engineering heavy. And then we slowly started growing, made our first like sales and marketing hires and really like became like more of a, I don't know, like something that's, I think there's this interesting phase between, like when you're 10 or 20 people and when you're like 50, because like at that small size, everyone, what they do, you kind of get a sense of their personality, even if you're working remotely. And then I think around like 50 or so, I just stopped like recognizing everyone's names. I was like, there's still people at Brave that I have never met,
Yeah.
And then I think at that point, like from the security team's perspective, it becomes a little trickier because when you're a small size, it's easy to check in on everyone and make sure they understand what you're trying to do when you say, like, you have to get a YubiKey, you have to set up 2-factor, you have to use the password manager. You can even individually check in on people and say, like, hey, like, when was the last time you updated your machine? Do you need help from me to do it? And then, like, yeah, when you're larger, you just can't do that. You have to, like, set up automation. You have to set up, like, device policies to automatically do that. Yeah, and it does become more stressful because you just can't sleep at night knowing that everyone has been using the password manager. You kind of have to periodically like check in and just, make sure everyone is on the same page security wise.
And stuff sprawls too. Like I remember even when we were kind of growing in the marketing and sales side, it was like, there's all these just tools out there that everybody who has come to the company later was just accustomed to using, where it's actually like, these aren't really great. And you're kind of like, lots of exposure there, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Knowing what's being used half the time. There's so many different permissions people are just saying yes to and all of that in everyday work. Yeah, it is a weird stage. You definitely knew everybody, and then you don't. I know exactly how you feel on that one.
Yeah, like, exactly.
Oh my gosh, I didn't even know you were here. Okay, we've also grown a lot. Like we didn't have a search engine when Brave started. We didn't have any of this AI tooling. How is it adapting to those like major kinds of new lines that the company is kind of broaching into? How does the security team kind of grow to be able to manage those new surface areas that we didn't necessarily have before?
Yeah. So, I mean, at the same time, we've been growing our team. It's still pretty small. Like, I don't actually remember how many people report to me. I think it's around 7 or so. yeah, like when we started, it was one, it was just me, and I wasn't even full time on security. I was also just working on random browser features. Yeah, and then at some point, we even got like a data protection officer, Pat, who I hope we'll have on the podcast soon, and he's really kind of increased our maturity in terms of the way we think about regulations and legal compliance and a host of other issues.
How does the security team kind of evolved with some of these new features, right? Like AI features, right? Like, and I mean, it seems like so much of it's like training on people, but I don't know, like, how are you all thinking about this? One, there's these things are kind of new to the market, but also new use cases. Even something like having this API business where it's like, oh, now we have an index and now we're also like purposing API use for that too. Like, is it a matter of just getting the right people in place to kind of help grow the team, or how do you all position around that?
Yeah, search was a really interesting one because they were our first major acquisition, only one so far at Brave. And so it was kind of like we swallowed another startup, and they had their own processes, their own culture, like their own kind of like DevOps person and just way of doing things. And we don't want to slow them down too much because like Brave's security, I won't go into too much detail, but our processes are very strict. They're very like, you have to get these sign-offs and make sure a security team is like tagged on the correct parts that need our attention and so forth. Yeah, it turns out that like forcing them to go through that entire process would have been like a big burden on them, it seems. So we kind of had to adapt and make like a more lightweight version of that for them, which did involve making our own AI-based tools to like automatically flag security instances and so forth. So we could like move a little faster with them. So that was kind of interesting, is just like absorbing another code base, absorbing another team that had its own culture and its own people, etc. But also, yeah, it was really exciting to just have a search engine. Like that's been one of the most, I think, innovative things about Brave is we not only have our own browser, we have an independent search engine, even a search API now. It hasn't been a huge challenge in terms of making sure these things are security compliant, because at the end of the day, search is just another website, and we have plenty of websites, right? Like we have web engineers, we have that experience, and we know what kinds of attacks to look for. An interesting example was goggles. So this is actually one of my favorite features in Brave Search. I don't think any other search engine offers it, and I think it's massively underused by people who use Brave. Because
I agree.
yeah. So basically, goggles is this way that you can define rules to rank the search results. So if I'm only interested in getting search results from, let's say, like Stack Overflow, because I'm only interested in that one site, I can write a rule for that. And it's not that interesting for that example because I can just search Stack Overflow, but let's say I only want like Stack Overflow, GitHub, and other like technical sites. So I can make a rule that says only search these sites and then prioritize these kinds of results. So you can write these like rule sets to shape the web however you want. People have done examples where they have made rules that prioritize like right-wing sites versus rules that support like left-wing sites. It's great because like if people accuse Brave of being biased one way or the other, they can just make their own rules to offset that, and we'll still use Brave as the search engine behind it all. But yeah, so when that thing launched, we definitely had some interesting discussions around like this kinds of syntax we would support, and like just kind of like making sure, since this is something search engines have not generally supported, like we're not opening new attacks. So yeah, it's like when we add new features that allow users to like customize Brave or like shape it in certain ways, like that's where we are most like thoughtful about new.
When you kind of look at this from the user's point of view, right? I mean, obviously like site encryption was like a big one when you started here, right? Is the risk profile for users a lot more severe now than it was when you started at Brave? Or is it a lot of just the same kinds of practices, that good hygiene and things like that people should adopt, like more generally? Like, is the web a scarier place, or is it getting better, or just kind of moving along?
Yeah, it's hard to answer because I don't talk to users a lot. I do know we have constantly gotten reports from people that say like, oh, I've been hacked. Can you help me fix it? That's been nonstop sent to like the security at Brave email address. And unfortunately, it's hard to explain to people like we are the security team for Brave, but we don't secure your entire laptop. You can have a perfectly secure installation of Brave on, a system that's been compromised through some other app or has malware on it, and then there's nothing we can really do about that. At least right now, maybe someday. But my biggest complaint is I don't feel like we've done a good job as an industry of like teaching people about the security model of the web, as shown by the fact that these kinds of like misconceptions never stop, like, being sent to us.
Right.
I think we have in the last 8 years, stepped up two-factor security. Like a lot more people are aware that they should be enabling this on websites. Many, many more websites support it. We even have like passkeys now, which are ways you can even use like your phone or your computer's built-in security hardware as a two-factor. We've also made people a lot more aware of like SIM swapping, which is this attack where you take control of someone's phone number, use that to take over their two-factor authentication. And so I think I've seen a migration away from sites supporting the phone as the second factor and more people supporting like authenticator apps or YubiKeys or passkeys and so forth. All of that has been really positive, I think, for users. But yeah, like at the end of the day, I just wish the understanding that security people have about like how the web works, like how compromises happen, etc., is more just pushed down to the ordinary user.
Yeah. Are there ways that people can use their browser to better protect other areas of their experience on the web? Like people use different types of tools for different things. Like, for example, like we have this VPN, right, that has a firewall built into it to kind of help bring device level protection. Are there any other ways that like you look at the security model for the web and maybe, like people talk about like signing things with crypto wallets or even with AI and authenticity of content, things like that? Are there ways that a browser can help to bring, improve like the quality of figuring out what's actually real in this world? I mean, it seems like really timely because of all this election stuff going on, but
yeah, there's actually kind of two questions embedded in the question you just asked. The first one is like, how can people use browsers to improve their security overall? That's a great question because my answer to that is just download less software. Like as a security professional, we talk about things like reducing attack surface, which is like reducing the number of ways you can get compromised. And many people don't know that like the more apps and software you download, the bigger your attack surface. If you think about like what a website can do versus what a full app can do on your computer, like the website has way less permissions, way less privileges. So a compromised website on its own is not as bad as a compromised app, which could potentially like read files from your computer, access your stored passwords, things like that, things that normal websites cannot do. So an example of this is if there's a web version of some site, I will use it instead of downloading the app pretty much religiously. So I do not download, like, I trust Slack as a company. I know they have a security team. Still, I refuse to download Slack. I just use it in the web browser. I use Zoom in the web browser. Anytime I'm prompted to download something, I like look up if there's a web version, and I prefer to use that because browsers have like website sandboxing, and so each website is isolated from other websites, and websites cannot, in general, like read your file system and do other kinds of sketchy actions that apps generally can do. Although macOS, and operating systems have made improvements there. Yeah, and as to your second question about like the authenticity of websites, yeah, I'm curious what ideas you have there because I do not, I don't know. I think like we still haven't solved phishing, right? Like if you make a site that looks kind of like the login page to Gmail, some percentage of people will enter their Gmail password on it.
I just hear like hand waves. Let's verify use a blockchain ID, right? Like on some and basically like fingerprint some piece of content you make with it or something like that. But I don't know if there's anything like meaningful there yet, or if it's just people talking about it. And so I guess I was wondering if maybe, are you seeing anything interesting there on your side of the thing, like where these things should come together?
I mean, certainly early on there was, I remember like around 2014, there was this phase where people were very suspicious of like certificate authorities who are the entities that issue TLS certificates to websites, which ultimately prove like that a website is the site that you think it is. Yeah, there was a lot of thoughts of like, oh, what if we replace that with a blockchain? So instead of going to, let's say, brave.com and the certificate is issued by like GlobalSign or someone like that, instead you check a blockchain, like a series of signatures to make sure like this is really, the certificate for Brave. And, we decentralize things, we get rid of certificate authorities. Maybe in a world where everyone has a blockchain client on their computer that's trustworthy and can like do these kinds of verifications, that would work out. But I think like for whatever reason, none of those things have like really taken off.
How much do you think about security when it comes to like other types of like digital infrastructure, right? Like voting machines or just banking in general and all these things where like so much of our lives are kind of pent up in these places or our choices that we're making. Have you seen improvements on that front at all?
Not a whole lot, I guess. There's people, speak to their research, but I was on the review board for a security conference called DEF CON for the last 7 years until 2024 when I took a break. But every year we just got hundreds of submissions that were people hacking random items around them. Some of them were predictable, like, combination locks, things that are meant to be for security. Some were just like, I hate to say the word junk, but just these like random like IoT devices that is made by some like random company
Right.
and sold to like, thousands of sometimes more people that where no one has audited the security. There was a really famous case of like baby monitors being hacked, so these cameras you use to like monitor your baby, hackers could get into them, like access the video feed and the audio, which is very scary, as a like if you're a parent who's really concerned about this kind of privacy, like that would be really creepy. But yeah, like I don't see those things getting meaningfully better because if you're just trying to sell a product, the average person is not going to like audit how secure it is, right? So that's
Right.
until it gets hacked, like the market has no way of like determining if it's worthwhile from a security point of view, and so people will just buy it. With baby monitors, maybe that's a case where like that's a high level of concern, and so people are looking for more reputable companies, asking questions like, does this company have a security team? Has it had like third party audits and so forth? But yeah, for random IoT devices, like I don't know, like vacuum cleaners and like things like that, which are just being more and more connected online. Like I don't see things getting a lot better.
Mm-hmm. No, that's interesting. Looking out at the future of these things, are you seeing, or even present to future, when we started at Brave, the private software industry, like privacy preserving, however you want to bucket it, right? Privacy software, I guess, was still pretty like nascent. It wasn't to where it is now, where like you've got companies that have like 100 million plus users in some cases, or you have something like Signal where tons of people are using it. When you look out at the future, like, do you see more of these things kind of just being built into other applications people are using, like better security practices or protocols that are you seeing a better convenience factor with this stuff like over time, or is it still kind of a big point of friction from your point of view?
Oh, Signal's an interesting case because they did exist when Brave was founded. They just had a lot fewer users, and I think they were called
Mm-hmm.
like TextSecure or like Whisper Systems or something. I was using it at the time, but like most of the people I knew weren't. And Signal, I think, did a great job of making this kind of like end-to-end forward secret encryption very usable to the point where you could not tell that it was an encrypted messenger. It just seemed like any other messenger you would download. And by being so usable, like I think they inspired other messengers at the time, like WhatsApp, iMessage, even Facebook Messenger, to adopt their same model of end-to-end encryption, which has been a really positive change for like people's privacy in the world. So yeah, that's like a really inspirational story of like if you just make something that's encrypted under the hood but works the exact same as the things people are used to, like it's much more likely to get users, right? Because it's not like encryption's a burden, it's just another selling point on top of an existing product, right? It's like I
Yeah,
can use
yeah.
a messenger or I can use like a messenger that's essentially the same but with better privacy. And so that's an easy selling point.
Totally, or like YouTube with no ads kind of thing, where
Yeah.
it's like you get all these cool privacy bonuses too. Is there anything we didn't cover that you want people to know about?
Trying to think of like what questions we were talking about in advance. I think the AI, like everyone's asking about AI these days, like how
Mm-hmm.
is AI going to change security? And I don't have a great answer for that. I certainly think like a lot of security work is very boring and can be automated, and that sort of thing is would be interesting to me. But yeah, I think right now there's a lot of speculation on whether AI is going to be able to find like novel security attacks and make it so like the bad guys who are like trying to attack the American infrastructure are suddenly going to be able to find all these like cool new exploits we don't know about.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's kind of like an interesting frontier right now.
Totally. Where can people find more of your work or find you online?
Yeah, I hate to say it, I'm like not. I've been trying to cut down on my web footprint recently. I still have a Twitter account, so it's twitter.com/bcrypt, and yeah, that's about it. Honestly, I don't really
Cool.
post anymore. But yeah, everyone, they can reach me at jan@brave.com with, specific questions, although I might not respond.
All good. All good. Thank you, Jan. Really appreciate you coming on today, and love to have you back sometime too to kind of go over any updates or anything interesting that you all have to share with us. Thank you for taking the time today.
Cool. Thanks, Luke.
Thanks for listening to the Brave Technologist podcast. To never miss an episode, make sure you hit follow in your podcast app. If you haven't already made the switch to the Brave browser, you can download it for free today at brave.com and start using Brave Search, which enables you to search the web privately. Brave also shields you from the ads, trackers, and other creepy stuff following you across the web. From privacy concerns to limitless potential, AI is rapidly impacting our evolving society. In this new season of the Brave Technologist podcast, we're demystifying artificial intelligence, challenging the status quo, and empowering everyday people to embrace the digital revolution. I'm your host, Luke Mulks, VP of Business Operations at Brave Software, makers of the privacy-respecting Brave browser and search engine, now powering AI with the Brave Search API. You're listening to a new episode of the Brave Technologist, and this one features Paul Barron, who is the founder of the Paul Barron Network and Media Company. Paul started his career in Silicon Valley at Microsoft before moving into media. He's an accomplished author, filmmaker, and thought leader in technology and blockchain. He's published Written Works, a documentary on Amazon Prime, and innovated through his venture PBN3, exploring cutting-edge tech and blockchain. In this episode, we discussed why he thinks AI will have a negative impact on the blockchain and how AI and crypto will converge over time, how people underestimate AI's ability to scale despite its speed and the latest advancement in compute requirements, and why gaming is the gateway to Web3 growth, leading us to an adoption curve that's even faster than the internet. Now for this week's episode of The Brave Technologist. Paul, welcome to the Brave Technologist podcast. How are you doing today?
Excellent. Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, thanks for coming on. I've been looking forward to this one. We haven't had really a lot of episodes with people that are on the media side, but it looks like your background kind of a bit of a pioneer on the podcasting front, but also you did a whole bunch of other things too leading up to that. Why don't you help set the table a bit for the audience? Like, how did you kind of find your way into what you're doing now? And was it just kind of a keen interest or just a fortunate chain of events?
It was kind of a very interesting story. My background, coming out of college was getting into computer science. Built a pretty good career there working with Microsoft and in the retail systems sector. So worked with huge Fortune 500 brands, developing technology in the early stage of retail tech. And then eventually kind of fell into media kind of in a backwards way. And then, decided I was bored with computer science and running developers and traveling mostly in Asia at the time. Moved back home to Austin and got into really consulting for technology in the retail sector. And there wasn't a lot of media out there. So we fell into kind of a media product. We started building websites. It was very natural for me because I was very tech savvy. So it was easy enough to get dev teams in that era of building websites. It was a little bit more technical than it is today. And then, we started really kind of understanding how new media would work and started going into that direction, which launched, of course, our podcasting products, which date as far back as 2007. We actually had a podcast at that time.
Wow.
It was kind of in that role, and we built a network in various business sectors, mostly in the B2B space, and then we launched a tech platform that is PBN. Our original goal was to cover all things innovative, and one of the areas we touched on early was AI, robotics, EV, and blockchain was kind of the fourth leg of the stool. And before you knew it, man, the channel and all of our podcasts just started blowing up on crypto and blockchain. So we just put our heads down, 4 or 5 years ago and started diving in and just learning everything we could and really getting into the media side of it. So that's where we are today.
No, that's awesome. How has it been kind of seeing this boom in podcasting and just from your perspective of being there so early, has it been interesting to watch it evolve?
In the beginning, when we started first doing, mixed media, a lot of companies, especially in the publishing world, they didn't understand it. I actually ended up merging some media companies with old school publishers in the day. And they didn't understand podcasting and they weren't very keen on the fact that video would be the future. This is, 2007 to 10.
Mm-hmm.
It got so bad in those companies that finally I just said, yeah, this isn't working for me. So I separated from that group, which we had merged those media companies with, and started doing all my own gig. And I think, the evolution, first of all, is much like any innovative technology. You have to believe in it and be very convicted that
Mm-hmm.
this is going to happen. And I had seen it, I was kind of born and bred in Silicon Valley in the sense of seeing Microsoft go through the antitrust lawsuits, deal with what was the birth of the internet, working with a lot of developers that were basically building the backbone of what we know as Web 1 and then eventually
Mm-hmm.
Web 2. So when podcasting and RSS came about, I had a chance to meet Adam Curry, who's the guy who pretty much created the RSS concept, and Dave Weiner, who was the dev behind it. And I saw, oh my gosh, this is decentralized distribution. Nobody's in control of this. This is the future. So
Mm-hmm.
it was
We're huge RSS fans.
So I was like, I'm all in. Let's do it. The only problem was it took a decade for it to get going.
Right. No, that's great. I mean, it sounds like you were early to the crypto space too, the blockchain space, or
Mhm.
how we're framing Web3, I guess nowadays. How has it been watching that evolve?
We've started really tracking crypto in 2013 and 14. Bitcoin, of course, was kind of came on the scene. And in the early days, I was a huge skeptic. In fact, I was not a believer. And we continued to kind of punch holes in the concept. And as it developed and eventually Ethereum launched, I started to repace my theory of what decentralized finance would look like. At the time, that was very early on in the stage of crypto. And because I was still looking at blockchain as being some sort of authenticity model that eventually enterprise would use, and, like a Microsoft or a big food manufacturer, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I realized, oh, no, wait a minute, there's a lot more here when you uncover this hood. And before you knew it, then you realize, okay, this is DeFi. This is going to change the way we do everything in the next generation of the internet. That was really kind of what flicked the light on for us. And we just said, all right, we're in, let's do it.
How have you all tried to differentiate? Because if you take 5 minutes of searching on YouTube, right, you see all sorts of bonkers speculative videos about, price predictions and whatnot. You guys seem much more serious than that. Is that kind of how you differentiate?
Well, I mean, we're a real media company and we're a real research team. And we also have a SaaS product. So we're tech people at heart. We're also media people at heart. We blend something that is quite a bit different than I think almost everybody in the crypto space that we, outside of the big box publishers like a CoinDesk or a Masari or someone like that. Ours is quite a bit of a different angle. We're here for the tech kind of thing, but we also want to have fun in the investing side. So we'll play with meme coins, and we're not huge believers in the infrastructure of what Bitcoin represents, but we're a big believer in Bitcoin as a whole, as a market, leader and as a store of value. But I think for us, the differentiation is we're a 2-decade-old media company, and it took us a long time to kind of get to where we are. And its tech has become kind of the new frontier for us in terms of how we're focused, even though we still do have other B2B verticals. So I think that talent has been one that has not existed in the crypto space or the blockchain space. And we're kind of, I would say, in a sweet spot right now. We're kind of a cross between, a crypto channel and a Bloomberg TV or a CNBC. And the difference is that we go after the real underlying architecture of what's changing this industry. And that's including everything from all the different blockchains that are really making huge inroads right now, whether it's Avalanche or what Solana's been able to do. You look at the Ethereum network, all the potentials there. And then you get outside that and you get into a lot of other tokens. We launched a SaaS product, which is our Market Sentiment Index. That's a product we've been building for a decade.
Wow.
Basically, it's very similar to a large language model for AI. We just suck in a lot of data from the crypto space, and then we measure sentiment on it. So that's also been a big differentiator for us as well in the market.
That's awesome. What's the most interesting thing from your point of view that you find yourself kind of rabbit holing into with what's going on in the space right now?
I think, from a regulatory standpoint, and also you look at the moves that are happening on a global macro level. This is probably one of the biggest areas that I see, understanding finance and understanding tech. Those are very rare things that companies and media companies can do. Usually they're one or the other. They're either a really heavy tech media company or they're a really heavy finance. We're kind of blessed to have both angles. So unfortunately, that's kind of like a mark of the beast, I feel like, because we know what's under the hood. And then at the same time, we understand the macro and the global economics of what's happening to the fiat system. So that's my biggest concern right now is just the US dollar, how it's going to be represented, in the next 20 years as we continue to see a lot of very interesting things happening globally, especially in the digital asset space. So that's really what we're keeping a very close eye on is a unique transition between the struggle that is happening between the US government and crypto, really. I mean, if you look at what Gary Gensler is trying to do now with the SEC and, claiming Ethereum as a security, that in itself, if that comes to be real, if that becomes a reality, the impact on the crypto market, even though here in the US is still, I would say, docile, the greater impact on the market, I think, would be significant. So these are things that we're watching very, very closely.
How much do you see Bitcoin as kind of a disruptive force in global economics?
Yeah, I see it strictly as, a lot of people give me flack for this, but when you dive into the real, because I was a Bitcoiner. When you first get into crypto, Bitcoin is kind of I feel like the gateway drug. And when you start going into it and understanding on-chain transactions and the limitations that Lightning represented, it started making me think through it differently. It's not that it's bad. Bitcoin is still, I think, the alpha asset in the class, but I look at it more as a store of value. I don't see it as a replacement for money. First, it doesn't have the infrastructure, from an on-chain transaction standpoint to even get there. Now, could that change? Sure. Though that in itself is kind of a very political thing because of the devs that are involved in Bitcoin. So globally, I will say that nation states will continue to buy it. We'll probably see a lot more activity in this just because of what's happening with the BRICS nations. Who knows if Qatar is actually buying Bitcoin today? We just saw just today that the US government just sold some of their Silk Road Bitcoin. So it's clear that the value is there. And I think, the performance of the ETFs with BlackRock and ARK and just the unbelievable 9 ETFs that are out there, there's a place for it for sure in the world financial system.
Are there any other areas that are kind of concerning for you? I would imagine the next natural step that a lot of people go to with where crypto could go with nation states is around like CBDCs and other types of stablecoin uses. What's your take on that?
I'm very fearful of a controlled central bank currency. When you look at a CBDC and the potential of, kind of what's happening with China on the social credit score, where we could be going, in other Western countries around CBDC, including the EU, which is already kind of moving in this direction with Christine Lagarde and what she's been able to do, both with regulation, because obviously MiCA changed the kind of the format of, the market infrastructure of the EU around crypto. They're ahead of the United States. So I look at it this way, is that Europe will probably be the first that really tests this model. And if you look at some of, just the WEF countries and you go down the list, you're probably going to see a handful of others that might try it. But I'm a little concerned with that at some point. I think this is going to eventually come to a head in terms of what true decentralized finance. But at the same time, we had a little bit of a win in the Coinbase trial where the judge said, okay, self-custody wallets are just that. They're not really governed under this particular case with the SEC around, security tokens. So I think there's still we believe there's going to be a positive outcome here, but I think there's just so many other directives from the industries that are surrounding blockchain as a whole, whether it's gaming, what we'll see in real world assets, tokenized securities, all of those are going to blow up. And some of the chains that benefit from that will be the ones I think that win.
Interesting. The other thing I was really kind of eager to ask you about, because of your background that goes back into like AI early and crypto early, like, do you see the two of these things kind of converging over time? And how do you see them kind of converging, if that's a factor, or kind of having use cases around both of these things?
Well, unfortunately, I think that AI will probably.
From privacy concerns to limitless potential, AI is rapidly impacting our evolving society. In this new season of the Brave Technologist podcast, we're demystifying artificial intelligence, challenging the status quo, and empowering everyday people to embrace the digital revolution. I'm your host, Luke Mulks, VP of Business Operations at Brave Software, makers of the privacy-respecting Brave browser and search engine, now powering AI with the Brave Search API. You're listening to a new episode of the Brave Technologist, and this one features Preston Byrne, who's a lawyer with the law firm of Brown Rudnick LLP. There, Preston advises cutting-edge technology startups in crypto, AI, and consumer internet sectors. In this episode, we discuss the role that crypto and AI could play in the upcoming elections, challenges in regulating cryptocurrency and blockchain technology, the benefit of using public-private keys as a solution to authenticate communication to avoid scams and fraud. And now for this week's episode of The Brave Technologist. Preston, welcome to the Brave Technologist podcast. How are you doing today?
Yeah, all right. Good to see you, Luke.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, just to get stuff started, can you give us a little bit of background of like how you ended up getting into looking at law and crypto and a little bit of your background in the space?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so there's a long story and a short story. The short story is I'm a lawyer, right? And so I advise crypto companies in the space. The longer story is I used to be a banking lawyer and I was extremely jaded about banking law. I was working in London in the wake of the financial crisis, 2009 to 2013. And at the time, there were a lot of people out there who were quite critical of the banking industry. And I, being a junior associate in a very large law firm who was very bored, was very attracted to that criticism. And I found my way to Bitcoin, later Ethereum. And I think within 6 months of discovering Ethereum, I had my own startup and was building prototypes for banks and all that sort of stuff. After doing that for a little while, until about 2017, I was a lawyer in England, of course. I decided to come home to the US, became a lawyer here, opened my own practice in 2018. And I've been practicing law and advising interesting technology entrepreneurs ever since.
Obviously, blockchain technology and crypto is pretty disruptive to a lot of areas. Do you see banking as kind of that big area that's the most ripe for disruption? Where do you see this kind of playing out as far as areas where it's going to be disrupting existing technology the most from your point of view?
Yeah, banking's they've been asking to be disrupted for the better part of a decade and a half. They have really good technology in banking, right? If you're in England, for example, they've got a thing called faster payments. You can send a payment from one bank account in England to another bank account in England at two completely different banks, and it settles instantaneously, right? That's super. They still haven't cracked that problem cross-border. They still haven't cracked that problem in the United States. And crypto has had that problem cracked for a very, very long time. So people open their phones. If you want to move some Tether from A to B, you can do that instantaneously with practically no fees or very low fees compared to ACH or wire transfer. So banking's just not competitive. But I think ultimately that's the first step. On the one hand, yes, you could say this is going to be a cross-border payment solution. On the other hand, you then have other types of intermediary relationships, right? So like what you guys work on at Brave, which is that you have large centralized advertising monopolies, essentially, which hog, right, entire markets. You've got something like Google, and I'll navigate through Google all day. I'll use their products. I'll use YouTube. And the only people who really benefit from that are creators in some cases where there's revenue share, right? But it's not a huge amount of money, or websites that are hosting Google ads. But at the end of the day, it's a really bad deal for the websites, and it's a really bad deal for content creators, and it's a really great deal for Google. So we have the tech to do interesting things. Of course, shilling for Brave is one of my favorite things to do. But there are other, there are other projects out there that try to achieve similar things in other domains, right? So Helium is a good one where they've got a distributed wide area network, which they think is going to be useful for controlling IoT devices. That's been remarkably successful at distributing infrastructure, which is owned by the people who are running it, not in a formal legal sense, but in a practical sense, because they have the control over the protocol, they're benefiting from the protocol, and they're first-class citizens participating in the protocol. You also have other things like Filecoin, for example, which is trying to do that with storage space, or Chia, which is trying to do that with proofs stored on server racks. So you've got all these different approaches to decentralizing intermediaries and allowing people to use consumer grade hardware in their own homes. So I could see maybe there's another project, I think it's called Morpheus. It's being started by David Johnston and Eric Voorhees. I could have gotten the name wrong. So guys, excuse me if I screwed it up. They've got an AI startup where you're going to be doing AI large language model training using the hardware on your desktop, kind of like in the same manner as SETI at home, instead of outsourcing that to large compute clusters that are run by Sam Altman or Microsoft or Google or Facebook or all the traditional tech majors. With everything in crypto, the theme has always been, right? Bitcoin was be your own bank. That's really not the case. You're not your own bank. Mm-hmm. What you are is just kind of a co-owner in a system which performs a bank-like function. And sometimes people will build in incentives into that system, which incentivize you to provide certain types of infrastructure that operate the system. And so mining was the original one. And now, of course, we've got infinite variations on mining, staking, proof of this, proof of that people are experimenting with to see which one sticks. What is interesting to me is the idea that you can disaggregate. We've all got, I'm talking to you on a MacBook M1. That compute 50 years ago would have been unthinkable, that kind of compute on a home desktop. Just like it would have been more computing power than every cluster in the world combined, just sitting on a desktop in front of me. With that, plus with now the potential to run AI language models, which you can run, they're only a couple hundred gigs in size, so that people can run on their own laptops. You can run all kinds of infrastructure by yourself as long as you've got a way to talk to people. And so the potential is that you're going to have a lot of different intermediaries and all kinds of different domains getting disintermediated because people want to own the rails on which those communications, transactions, or whatever else it is that they wish to impart or receive are sent. That's what turns me on about crypto.
Yeah, I know. I think you did a really great job of kind of setting the table of the pros there. Is there something about crypto and blockchain technology that just makes it inherently more difficult to regulate than what existing laws were set up for? Or is it's something we can kind of put into a box?
Yeah, it depends on what you mean by regulate.
Yeah.
That's the typical lawyer answer is it depends.
Right.
I'm sure you've heard lots of Weasley lawyers saying it depends over the years when you deal with the complicated novel technology because they don't want to get pinned down on anything. If you're talking about easy to regulate in terms of easy to suppress, the answer is no, it's not very easy to suppress because the decentralized nature of it means that in order to turn the system off, you need to get every single node, or really every single node except one. You need to get all of them. You need to take them all down. It's a cross-border system which operates everywhere in the world. There's no regulatory harmonization between the different nation states where these systems are being run. The prospect that there's going to be any regulatory harmonization, maybe in the mid-90s, there was a possible future where the United States could have imposed its regulatory regime on the rest of the world when it was at the absolute apex of its hyperpower status. But I think that those days are behind us. So the question is, can you get Russia, China, the US, and the various European member states, and now, of course, West Africa, which is becoming an absolute giant in the crypto space, and South America too, can you get all those countries to agree on something? And the answer is no, because they're going to say, well, we can get a comparative advantage against all these other countries by liberalizing this stuff and allowing people to develop it. That's one element of it. Is it possible to suppress? No. Is it possible to create a sensible regulatory regime which will capture 85 or 90% of the crypto projects out there and improve consumer protection? Probably. I think the UK has done something very similar to that with its new financial promotion rules, which basically they haven't taken crypto and tried to shoehorn it into a securities box like the United States has. At the same time, there are some onerous aspects to that regime, like you can't sell to accredited investors, which you can in the United States. You can't sell tokens to accredited investors in the UK unless you've had the offering documents approved by an FCA authorized entity, right? And so I'm admitted in England and the US. So comparing the two jurisdictions is something of a hobby of mine, you might say. I get out a lot. I'm real fun at parties. But so essentially, though, it is possible to do that. I think in the US, there hasn't been the political will to do it because I think that fundamentally there are two political parties. One of them is insane, and the other one is also insane, and it wants to control the internet as well. And so the one that wants to control the internet is not particularly keen that people should have self-custodied crypto, self-operating software systems, because ultimately they want it to be subject to state control. And so that's why we haven't got a regulatory regime which makes sense in the US yet.
Yeah, well, and it seems like which regulators, right? Because the SEC gets a lot of coverage, but then you also see CFTC and then the FCC, all these different areas where you're talking about internet technology, but you're also talking about banking and finance, and you're also talking about all of these different, this blob of things, right? And that's where it makes it difficult for us too sometimes because everything we're doing isn't neatly in a box. And I know you've talked about like library, like in the past as like one of those projects where it's gotten hit hard by regulation, but it's a really promising kind of technology, right? Like I don't want to put words in your mouth.
That's absolutely right. The problem we have in the US is that the closest and most analogous regime, regulatory regime to what most people are doing in crypto is the securities regime, right under the Securities Act. The problem is that the government has had 14 years or 13 years to say, okay, well, we can recognize that crypto is this sui generis, unique asset, which really doesn't do or perform the same function as a security. If you really dust it off, it doesn't do that. However, there's a really overbroad common law test, which has been applied to various cryptocurrency issuers. And the SEC has sought to enforce against those issuers, most prominently Ripple Labs. And the problem is they're losing, right? Because they're going to the courts. And, initially, if you looked at this 10 years ago, you might have been like, okay, I think it's kind of it's a dead cert. It's the SEC is going to win and the other side's going to lose. But the technology has advanced so much that now judges are beginning to say, well, hold on a minute. Is this really the appropriate regime? Is this really a proper test? The space has a character all its own. And that character doesn't really neatly align with what the securities laws were intended to regulate. And so the SEC is being, they've got some victories in the case of Library. They've got some defeats in the case of Ripple Labs. And where we're left is that, like, okay, let's look at a country like England, which never had this problem, right? Because they had a list. They said, what's a security? Well, it's on this list or it's not. If it's not on this list, it's something else, right? And it's governed by, traditional common law principles around contracts and fraud and that sort of thing. Well, it's a crypto asset. Well, it has its own characteristics. Well, let's come up with our own regulatory regime, which is specific to this thing, which both allows it to continue to exist in its current form and protects consumers by imposing certain disclosure requirements and transaction requirements on service providers, issuers, and intermediaries. What about that? And that way it can continue more or less uninterrupted as it has been before, but we've created its own little regulatory corral where it can live and happily do whatever it's going to do. The US just hasn't done that. And they've had every opportunity in the world to do it, but for some reason, the government just can't pull it together.
Are you optimistic about the potential for them to pull that together? Do you see any signs that there might be something bright in the future around some kind of common sense regulatory regime around this? Or is it still too early to call, I guess?
Without offering a political opinion either way, I think if Joe Biden wins, it's not going to happen for at least another 4 years because the executive doesn't want it to happen. And the people who support the executive don't want it to happen. I think if Donald Trump wins, I think the likelihood is higher, but we haven't heard any noises from the Trump campaign as yet that are pro-crypto, right? And the last time they were in power, they had Steve Mnuchin as the Treasury Secretary, and Donald Trump and Steve Mnuchin were both very, very anti-crypto and anti-Bitcoin. Really, I think based on a misunderstanding of how the market worked and what it does. So I think there's an opportunity to move the Overton window here. There are early indications that the Trump campaign might be interested in doing that, but nothing concrete as yet. I think there is one little ray of hope, which is that the U.S. might actually pass a stablecoin bill, and it might actually do it this Congress. The rumor is that things are moving forward on that front because Europe has one. So Europe passed this thing called MiCA, which allows people to issue fiat or commodity-backed stablecoins. And the U.S. is looking at that, and they're looking at the digital yuan, and they're saying, hold on a second, if Europe and the Chinese have these instant cross-border transfer systems, which anyone anywhere can access, we're going to lose, and the dollar is going to lose because we're stuck with all of these inferior cross-border value transfer systems, banks, ACH, and wire transfer, and SWIFT, and all that nonsense. So there may be some impetus in the U.S. Congress to try to cement the dollar, to defend the dollar by basically allowing private stablecoin issuers to service this offshore business as long as they patrol the on-ramps and the off-ramps to the system like Circle would do. As yet, it's currently unclear whether Congress is going to be able to make sense out of anything in an election year, much less this. But the rumor is there's some bipartisan support behind that, and it's just a matter of time before they do something.
Kind of switch gears a little bit. One thing that's been surprising to me is your odds are so stacked against your survival rate as a startup to begin with, let alone having to navigate all of this. Have you seen it being an impediment to startup and innovation, having to kind of have this uncertainty overhead, or what's your general take on how that's impacted startups from your point of view?
Big time. There are a lot of layer one startups that should be in the United States or exchanges or other types of crypto businesses are opening up shop in Abu Dhabi. They're opening up shop in London. They're opening up shop in Canada. they're not opening up shop in the United States. Europe generally isn't the big winner because it's just a pain in the neck to do business there. London, at least, you don't have to, like in Germany, if you're going to set up a company, you have to capitalize it with 50,000 euros. It's just crazy. So in London, you just submit a form, you pay $20 and you got yourself a limited company. Hey, presto. So it's a lot easier. So yeah, I think things have definitely moved offshore. I've seen a lot more businesses that, particularly L1s, that new L1s have said, you know what, we don't want anything to do with the United States. We're going to run the thing out of Switzerland. We're not going to have any staff in the US. And it's costing us money and jobs. And as an American and English corporate lawyer, it's having an impact on my practice, which is really annoying.
Sure,
so I'm very, very unhappy with Gary Gensler about that. They need to interact with the US. So usually we pick them up that way, or they have employees here or a labs entity here or something. But most of the token issuance, which absolutely, if we had a sensible regulatory regime, the US would be doing tens of billions of dollars of token issuance business a year within a regulated framework, investor protections, all that nonsense. And the government's losing out on all that work because it refuses to give us a regulatory regime, which makes sense.
One thing I've seen you talk a lot about, and I'd love to kind of get a little bit more context from you on, is kind of this concept of, for developers that have been building out there, this local first client side kind of approach that I've seen you talk about a little bit.
Yep.
Separating that from a lot of server side stuff. And maybe you can kind of frame up a little bit about what you mean by that, just so folks who are building might get a sense of a reasonable direction or why that might be important.